The counseling process, central focus. According to Arlo, the principles and techniques of psychoanalysis are based upon the psychoanalytic theory of neurosis. Those techniques and principles that evolved through Freud's study of the client's nervous disorders are employed to make the contents of the unconscious conscious. The basic technique for bringing unconscious material into awareness is called free association. The client's productions in free associations are then interpreted by methods similar to those proposed in the interpretations of dreams. Freud also discovered a phenomenon he labeled transference. Transference describes as an attitude the client holds for a significant past person that the client now projects upon the therapist. The working through of the transference is a major therapeutic principle of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalytic therapy makes us use of these principles to help people solve their problems through achieving insight into the causes of their neurotic behavior and by discovering alternatives to it. Conditions for growth. The standard technique for studying the functioning of the mind is called the psychoanalytic situation. Arlo, 1979. The client lies on a couch looking away from the therapist and expresses whatever comes to mind. The looking away from the therapist is designed so that the therapist will not influence through nonverbal behavior the production of whatever comes to the client's mind. The therapist's role is to observe and occasionally interpret the content of the client's free associations. The client, in turn, reflects and comments on the interpretation. The purpose of this situation is to allow repressed materials to come to conscious verbal awareness in order to examine, interpret, and eventually resolve the psychic conflict. Process of therapy. According to Arlo, 1979, the treatment process is composed of 4 phases. Number 1, the opening phase. Number 2, the development of transference. Number 3, the working through of the transference. Number 4, the resolution of transference. These stages are described. The opening phase. This phase is comprised of 2 parts. The first part consists of an initial set of interviews during which the client's problems is determined and a decision is made as to the appropriateness of analysis to the solution of the client's problem. The structure of the analytic situation is explained, particularly the delineation of responsibility of the therapist and the client. If the therapy proceeds after the first few sessions, then the second part of the opening phase begins with the client resuming the position on the couch. The therapist continues to learn and understand about the client and the underlying dynamics of unconscious conflicts. During this phase, the therapist deals with the apparent themes the client presents and does not facilitate production of unconscious material. During this phase, everything the client says and does is observed and recorded for future reference. The development of transference. The development and analysis of transference is the cornerstone of psychoanalysis. In this phase, the client's feelings for the therapist, who has become a significant figure in the client's life, are used to demonstrate how the client perceives, interprets, and responds to the present in the same ways the client responds to significant persons in the past. With understanding of how this past behavior influences and determines present behavior, the client can choose to behave in less rigid ways and can learn to make more appropriate decisions. Concomitant to the analysis of transference, the therapist must be aware of the possibility of countertransference towards the client. The possibility of countertransference, the therapist's unresolved feelings for significant others that may be transferred to the client, must be analyzed and worked through. This step in the analysis is necessary so that the therapist can be confident that unresolved feelings are not interfering with the analysis of the client's transference. The working through phase. This phase is a continuous process throughout the analysis of transference and overlaps with the previous phase. This phase involves the deepening of insight and understanding of the part of the client as the working through of one transference usually will precipitate the recall of a significant event, which in turn leads to further insights. The process of working through the transference is an evolving one, and with each working through, there is further clarification and understanding. The resolution of the transference. When the client and the therapist believes that the client's major conflicts have been worked through, a date is set for termination of the therapy. The purpose of this phase is to resolve the client's neurotic attachment to the therapist. Several aspects of this phase are common. One is there may be an intensity of symptoms as the client may be reluctant to give up the relationship and may maintain dependency on the therapist. The resolution of this aspect of therapy represents the finishing touches to the client's therapy. Sometimes further memories emerge related to interpretations made earlier in the treatment. These memories may be viewed as a gift from the client and may represent the client's acceptance of the termination of therapy. It is important to work through any grandiose fantasies or wishes the client may have regarding how the client will be after therapy is terminated. Finally, in psychoanalytic therapy, the focus is exclusively in intrapsychic process, how the client's mind works. Giovacchini, 1977. The therapist's views are not imposed on the client. The therapy is centered on interpretation within the transference context. A unique and powerful characteristic of the psychoanalytic process is the therapist's ability and willingness to allow transference to develop with the objective of increasing the client's autonomy by extending self-control over his or her inner primitive forces. Strategies for helping clients. According to Giovacchini, 1977, psychoanalysis focuses on the workings of the client's mind. The attainment of the Socratic motto, know thyself, is essential goal and thrust of the therapeutic strategy. Modern psychoanalytic therapists have modified and added to the treatment strategies developed by Freud, but the principles of treatment have remained basically unchanged. The most important strategy for helping clients know themselves is through the development and analysis of the transference relationship, which has already been described in the section under the counseling process. Therapists may use a variety of strategies as a catalyst in the development of conditions conducive to the therapeutic analysis for transference. Assessment of the client's emotional, situational, and medical readiness to participate in and profit from therapy is essential. Not all clients or problem situations lend themselves to the psychoanalytic approach. The early sessions are typically devoted to free association, dream interpretation, fantasizing, hypnotic techniques, or other ways of gaining access to the client's unconscious dimensions. Modern psychoanalytic therapists have developed a variety of treatment strategies based on Freudian formulations, which broaden the client's population, served and represented innovative refinements to classical psychoanalytic practice. Several of the modern innovations that depart from the traditional psychoanalysis are identified here. Maturation interventions. Maturational interventions or maturational communications, Kerman, 1980, are interventional strategies employed to move the client through a series of timed communications from the client to the therapist. Such timed communications permit the client to discharge emotions such as aggression, sexual impulses, etc., in the transference relationship at the client's own time of readiness. Kerman, 1980. In treating a young woman for depression, encourage the client to write letters to the therapist between sessions. The maturational communications enable the therapy to progress more efficiently. According to Kerman, the client's writing served as a catalyst for therapy sessions and facilitated the improvement of her depression because of the discharge of hostility in the transference and elsewhere. The strategy also facilitated the client's reality testing, and she was ready to begin sublimating the liberated psychic energy into constructive channels. Written facilitation of free association. The facilitation of clients' free association through a diary, written for the therapist between sessions at the client's choice of communication time, is another example of an innovative strategy. Pearson, 1965. The case of Mary provides one example of the use of the written diary as a catalyst for encouraging the resistant client to engage in free association. Progoff, 1977. Reflection of the unconscious negative portion of the ego by the therapist. This strategy, reported by Keston, 1980, is based on the rationale that the client, in this case a 10-year-old male, can deal with his own repressed oppositional negative attitudes when they are presented to him as an external adversary, because the client's manifestation of hostility had become unacceptable to his conscious ego and had been repressed. He had developed a pattern of self-destructive behavior. As an example, the client has developed a pattern of using school failure to triumph over authority figures such as parents and teachers. The therapist deliberately provoked the client into self-instruction in reading by creating a situation where the client believes the therapist was against the client's learning to read. The adversary situation was so strong that the client felt he had no way to defeat the therapist except by learning to read, which the client proceeded to do. Later, when the client discovered he had been tricked into learning to read, he was able to work through this anger and reached a rational understanding of his desire to defeat the therapist. The client was finally able to discard his need to prevail over authority figures and to adopt a success-oriented style of life. Reflection of the unconscious portion of the ego is a unique strategy aimed towards a particular client situation. It requires a thorough understanding of adaptive and intrapsychic forces within the client. The strategy presents a unique challenge to the client to defeat a parent-like figure in a way that provides a new model for gaining identification and acceptance. Supportive intervention. Langs, 1973. Recommended several specific interventions that are subtly interwoven with traditional analytic practices. He cautions that these interventions are not to replace traditional methodology and that these interventions should be employed judiciously. One of these interventions, called supportive intervention, adds interpretation, is painful or potentially disturbing. Supportive comments are not intended to be construed as reassurance or comfort, but are intended to build ego strength in the face of possible disassociation. Supportive confrontation is a second intervention designed to help the client face aggressive and self-destructive behavior and unnecessarily pathological defenses. Confrontations may contain alternatives to realistic and neurotic problems, the consequences of different avenues of possible behavior, and concern for the client's dangerous behavior to self. A third intervention involves depreciating and devaluing the client's maladjusted resolution of conflicts by showing its excessive cost. This intervention aims to motivate the client towards positive interchange and away from the acting out of conflicts. The outcome of depreciating and devaluing is to make the client's disturbed behavior less valuable, to place thoughts and actions in a more reasonable perspective, to assess the consequences of behavior and fantasies, and to seek healthier resolutions to problems. Mass time therapy. Rees, 1972. Briefly describes a method of mass time therapy which is used principally in the working through phase of psychoanalysis. Classically, in this phase, ego defenses are maximized, and although there may be insight, the working through of the client's defenses often cannot be accomplished in the hour-long session. Rees recommends 2, 3, or even 10 hours of consecutive interaction. During this time, defenses become obvious to the client and then useless as the interaction continues. The common defenses of intellectualization, projection, and denial are difficult to maintain, and primary process materials has the opportunity to emerge. Another reason for mass time interactions is that in the client's description of day-to-day life, there are usually extenuating circumstances, scapegoats, etc., to blame for failure. However, the longer sessions enhance the client's need for neurotic defenses and at the same time strips the client of excuses that prevents acknowledgement of defenses. At this point, only the transference qualities of the therapist are available. The transference then can be readily observed and interpreted by the therapist. Brief psychotherapies. Small and Belloc proposed a 6-step model for brief psychotherapies. Small, 1972. First, the problem is identified. Second, a detailed history is taken to secure data that will reveal the personal experience of the client and will lead to a diagnostic formulation. Third is the establishment of causal relationships. In the fourth step, methods of intervention are chosen based upon which factors are most amenable to change or demand change, and an assessment of ego functioning. Talking therapy is the most common technique. However, within the framework of verbal interaction, the focal technique, which provides for focus on selected problems or symptoms, represents a departure from traditional psychoanalysis. The client is guided by partial interpretation and selective attention to and selective neglect of the focal material. As for the role of interpretation, Small and Belloc suggests interpreting the precipitates as immediate catharsis. The strength of the interpretation is tempered by the use of moderate words, reassurance as the uncovering takes place, provision of an acceptable outlet for the client's drive, and provides the therapist's ego strength to the client. Small and Belloc also recommended environmental manipulation when it is appropriate and state that this technique represents the greatest departure from traditional psychoanalytic therapy. Such interventions as calling of family members or friends when the client's life may be in danger or referring the client for a job placement are examples of environmental manipulation. The fifth step of the model incorporates the working through phase. This phase involves the learning of new behavior and the extinguishing of maladjusted behavior. The final step is to leave the client with a positive transference in the sense that the therapist is likable, reliable, understanding, and accepting. The client is also left with the expectation that the therapist will provide help in the future. Sample case. A brief commentary and a few segments selected and edited for the case of Carla are presented for the purpose of illustrating some of the contemporary psychoanalytic techniques that one therapist used with an adolescent female client. Case of Carla, age 16, when counseling began. Carla, a 16-year-old female, was given up by her original parents at age 4. She was adopted at age 7. She was reared in a stable religious home. At age 14, she began having dreams of her adoptive father was making sexual advances towards her. Carla's ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality was ambiguous. This produced a love-fear relationship towards her adoptive father. At age 15, she exhibited chronic delinquent behavior, which included running away from home on numerous occasions, experimenting with drugs, and engaging in overt sexual relations with a wide variety of males. Carla's behavior produced a great deal of guilt, anxiety, and helplessness, and a fear that she was losing her mind. Initial therapy focused on dealing with her dream material. She reported that in one of her dreams, her adoptive father fondled her and was attempting to engage in intercourse with her, whereupon she awakened in terror. A brief segment of a therapy session about that dream follows. Therapist: how did you react to the dream? Carla: I know it was a dream, but I've had funny feelings about it. I guess I'm a little afraid of him. I find myself avoiding him. Therapist: so now you're not sure about how much of your imagery and fears of sexual relations with your father come from your dream or how much is projected from your conscious thoughts. The main dilemma from a psychoanalytic viewpoint was the conclusion between her dream content and her conscious thoughts. After a period of striving to do so, Carla is afraid to fantasize having normal daughter-father relations. Therapist: Carla, can you free associate on this idea of a healthy relationship with your father? Carla: pause, thoughtful silence. Okay. What I want to see is myself being in the room with him without having any sexual thoughts. Just be normal, to enjoy being with him and to trust him. I just want to be able to embrace him or be embraced, to have him kiss me on the cheek without pulling me back and thinking awful things. I guess I'm still having trouble getting away from all this stuff in the dreams. Therapist. It sounds like you're trying to separate all the images in your dreams and fantasies from your conscious experiences and desires, but there's a blockage. Can you free associate around that blockage? Carla. Thoughtful silence. I'm feeling kind of torn between two feelings. I have an image of a desire to be his little girl again, to be touched and caressed and hugged and loved. Another picture, the one that bothers me most, is of that more mature love relationship with him. It's like he's not really my father, but he's someone like my father. Like he's my boyfriend with all the qualities of my father. I guess that's what I want to have, like a boyfriend or like my father. In this segment, Carla verbalized the desire to have a love relationship with someone with her father's qualities. In the interviews that followed, she was able to work through her fantasies and clarify her distinctions between father child and father adolescent daughter relationship. She was also able to fantasize having appropriate heterosexual relationships. Later, the therapist employed psychoimagination therapy techniques, Shore, 1972, to help Carla rehearse action steps she could take to reestablish normal relations with her father. Therapist. Carla is already 17 at this point. You said you wish to be able to openly be with your father. Carry on both serious and casual conversations and feel no threat at all. Can you get in touch with your fantasies, project yourself into your desired encounter, and describe your actions and feelings? Carla, moment of thoughtfulness. I'm at home with my mother. We're talking and enjoying each other. I'm helping prepare dinner. I see Dad drive in the carport. He comes into the kitchen door and kisses my mom, then kisses me. I feel faint for a moment, then I remember exactly what I planned to do. I planned to put my mind on enjoying being with my parents instead of thinking about what I had happened in my dreams. Therapist. Can you project yourself into the emotions that you want to experience while at the same time holding to that view of the family situation as vividly and realistically as possible? Carla. Moment of thoughtfulness. I'm surprised how comfortable I'm feeling compared to a few months ago. I'm relaxed. I'm thinking of how different it is now. I see me talking, laughing, and listening to both parents, not putting ulterior motives into his voice and actions. I'm seeing him as the dad he really is and always has been. And I guess I'm pleased with me too, pleased that I can see myself as valuable and lovable. Even with my faults, I'm still a good daughter worthy of their trust. Therapist. You seem to be fully owning your dreams and fantasies. You're also painting a very positive picture. What are the words you're saying to your dad and mom and yourself? What are the emotions you want to feel and project for them to receive? Carla. Okay. I'm talking about the things that interest them, asking mom about her day at the office, asking dad about her visit to the ETV studio. I'm feeling good about having such interesting parents. I'm feeling comfortable with dad, but I'm also aware of my desire to enjoy and pay attention to both parents equally. I'm feeling good about me. Therapist. It sounds to me that you're rehearsing a perfect situation. I wonder if we can check out whether you are retreating to a previous stage in your earlier childhood or substituting a hoped-for family scene to keep from dealing with problems and anxieties which are too painful to face. Can we do some reality testing on these rehearsed fantasies you've just described? Carla. I thought about that too. I don't want to be defensive, but I really think I've progressed beyond that point. I do have some concerns that I may wake up and discover that I'm back like I was before. Oh, that frightens me. That I want to do is maintain what I've got and go on from there. I don't see myself as going backwards or deluding myself. The therapist, after many months of working with Carla, was attempting to utilize some modern innovative techniques derived from psychoanalytic therapy to help her open up action alternatives. These techniques, such as Shore's psychoimagination 1972-1980, Tien's psychosynthesis 1969, Greenwald's direct decision therapy 1973, and procedures used in the modern psychoanalysis of Sputnitz 1969, enables the therapist to extend Freudian's formulations far beyond the classical psychoanalysis. Even so, the counselor worked through the transference, resistance, and countertransference aspect with Carla. Contemporary therapists helping clients such as Carla may also opt to allow the client to experiment with and integrate at fantasy and reality and potentially self and not self, and the choices of actions all within the context of cooperative therapeutic alliance and encounter. Shore, 1980. Contemporary psychoanalytic therapists are often skilled in using imagery, rehearsal, practice, homework, problem solving, and decision strategies. The case of Carla provides a glimpse of only a few of the possible processes and techniques. Carla's case was fairly typical. Her ego had to gain control over her psychic energy by mediating the struggle between her id and superego to gain control of her life. Her id was impulsively demanding immediate gratification and attention by impelling her to act out of her instinct. Her superego was demanding perfectionism in her behavior by imposing parental, societal, and religious standards and heaping large doses of guilt upon her for failure to attain perfection. Through therapy, she was finally able to integrate fantasy and reality and bring the id and superego into a rational balance. For the reader who desires a diversity of case studies in addition to those we have cited, there are many available that have been recorded by both classical and modern practitioners. Goldman and Millman, 1978, have provided a rich array of case samples of psychotherapy. Also, Belkin, 1980, has provided several excellent case histories depicting both classical and modern psychoanalytic procedures with several different types and ages of clients. Attributions of the psychoanalytic system. Freud is considered to be one of the founders of psychotherapy, and as a medical doctor who treated nervous disorders, he must also be considered to be one of the founders of psychiatry. Hall, 1951. Freud's ideas influenced literature, art, religion, social sciences, and education during his time and continue to do so to some extent now. It is difficult to be aware of Freudian psychology and not see some of his concepts evidenced in human behavior, i.e., the influence of unconscious motivation, the symbolism in dreams, the use of defense mechanisms, and sexual ideology of conflicts, to mention a few. In the area of psychotherapy, the practice of talking therapy to alleviate symptoms has been carried forth in every major theoretical model of psychotherapy today. Anxiety, resistance, transference, and interpretation are familiar terms to practicing therapists from a variety of individual and group therapy models. Therapy models directly influenced by Freudian and psychoanalytic thought are ego counseling, Adlerian Gestalt, transactional analysis, and primal therapy. The most unique feature and valuable contribution of the psychoanalytic approach is the nurturance within the transference relationship of client autonomy and self control. Giovacchini, 1977. Shortcomings to the psychoanalytic system. There are several limitations associated with the traditional psychoanalytic method, particularly when considering that the method began to be developed nearly 100 years ago in a Victorian society whose people held values much different from those values held by the majority of peoples in the 1980s. Although there are several short-term treatments based on Freudian analysis, one of the major drawbacks of this approach is the amount of time required to complete analysis, the course of which may require several years. This inordinate time requirement seems somewhat ill-suited to the more quickly paced lifestyle of contemporary people. Also, associated with a lengthy time of analysis is the monetary expense, which may make analysis prohibitive to most people and the privilege of the affluent. Another limitation of this approach is the limited availability of analysis to the large number of people who seek therapy and counseling. There is simply not enough trained analysis to provide therapy to this many people. A further limitation related to the large number of persons seeking therapy is the multitude of reasons for coming to therapy, some of which would not be suitable in terms of the length of time required for analysis. For example, people go to therapy for help with marital, vocational, parenting, sexual, assertiveness, shyness, divorce, grief, loneliness, and a multitude of other problems. Although the applicability of Freudian analysis is known for its use in some of these areas, many of these problems are much more suited to a variety of therapy specialties and specialists who can provide help more quickly, less expensively, and more appropriately than through traditional analysis. Summary. Freud grew up in a time of scientific progress that influenced the development of Freudian psychology and also set the stage for the scientific study of human behavior. In his scientific study of human behavior, Freud postulated a basic biological motivating force in people to seek pleasure and avoid pain. He called this motivating force the pleasure principle. He also postulated a theory of unconscious motivation, meaning that much individual behavior is influenced by experiences, thoughts, and feelings that are not in conscious awareness. It was through the idea of material repressed into the unconscious that Freud's theory of neurosis was developed. For example, hysterical symptoms grew from repression of unacceptable impulses and wishes. Freud viewed human personality as an inner-working energy system composed of three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. In this personality system, the id functions as the original source of psychic energy, the ego as the executive of the personality, and the superego as the conscience and ego ideal. The development of this system of personality was influenced by childhood sexuality and followed a developmental sequence known as the stages of psychosexual development. From Freud's work with hysterical clients, the methods and techniques of psychoanalysis developed. The purpose of these techniques was to make the contents of the unconscious conscious so that the client could understand the reasons for neurotic behavior and thus behave differently. To these ends, Freud developed the free association method, which involved saying without censoring all the thoughts that come to mind. Interpretation was then applied to the client's free associations to foster client understanding and further lead to uncovering of unconscious material. The final phase of therapy involved the working through of the client's transference to the therapist of conflicts and wishes with significant others in the client's life. The ultimate goal and greatest strength of psychoanalytic therapy is the enhancement of the client's personal autonomy. During the latter years of Freud's life and immediately following his death, neo-Freudians such as Horney, Erikson, Sullivan, and Fromm made individual contributions that broadened psychoanalysis. Contemporary therapists have continued to extend and apply Freudian formulations in innovative ways to different kinds of clients in an ever changing society.